summer camp is making out. So, I have two options for you tonight. Do you want scary, or do you want something a little smutty? I hear smutty from this corner. Smutty in this corner. Here we go. Richard walked into his 5th grade classroom, and his teacher was standing at the desk as usual, and all of the tables were kind of covered with their paper mache volcanoes from science fair. And he went and he sat down in his regular seat at the back of class. And then everyone else came in and everyone got seated, and then the teacher stood up and she said, "Class, we have a new student joining us today, and I'm going to ask you to do everything you can to be extra kind to her. Her name is Mary, and her family was just in a terrible accident, and she's lost both her mother and her father. And she's joining us now in the middle of the year because she's come to live with her aunt and uncle here in our town. So class, can you be extra kind to Mary the way I know you can?" And they all said, "Yes, miss." Well, just then, the classroom door opened, and a young girl walked in. And she had like a knee-length skirt in dark gray, a little button-up blouse and a cardigan, and around her neck was a really cute choker with a like crimson ribbon tied around her neck. Well, she came in and she sat in the only empty desk, which was the one right in front of Richard. Well, Richard, over the next couple of weeks, he started failing his spelling tests and struggling with math because, you see, Richard couldn't think about anything other than that girl in front of him. And one day he worked up his courage and he reached in front of him and he tugged on her hair. And she turned and said, "What?" And he said, "Why do you always wear that ribbon around your neck?" And she said, "Well, Richard, maybe if you're very, very lucky, one day you'll find out." And she turned. Well, that's how that year went. And years passed, and they were in middle school. And Richard used to get to school really early to play Dungeons and Dragons with his friends. Richard was not the cool kid, just spoiler alert. And so they would get together in front of the math classroom, and he had a couple guy friends that they would play, with their dice, and they would play Dungeons and Dragons. And Mary's aunt and uncle, her adopted family, they had to bring her early to school so that they could go to work on time. So Mary would be there, kind of standing by herself while the boys were playing Dungeons and Dragons. Well, she, day by day, started standing a little bit closer, and a little bit closer, and a little bit closer. And then one day, one of the boys said, "I'm going to cast Mage Hand," and she said, "No, that's dumb. You should definitely have that guy who's a thief get the thing. That's a way better use of all of your skills." And all of the boys turned and they looked at her, and their eyes were huge behind their glasses. And they just stared at her, and one of them kind of put his hand over his pocket protector to make sure it was safe. And Richard said, do you want to play with us?" And Mary said, "Yes." And she started joining their Dungeons and Dragons game every morning. And it was Richard's favorite part of the day, especially when Mary laughed. Because she threw back her head when she laughed, and her neck was just beautiful with that crimson choker. And he knew that he could watch Mary laugh every day for the rest of his life and be happy. Well, years passed, and somewhere in the middle there, Richard worked up the courage to leave a note on her desk that said, "Mary, comma, I like the choker, it's cute," and then the heart shape, and then underneath it, anonymous, spelled ANONYMOUS. M-U-S. He also wasn't a very good speller. Remember all those spelling tests that he failed? So signed anonymous. Well, years passed, and finally in high school, Richard got up the nerve to ask Mary out. He reached out and he tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned and said, "What?" And he said, "Mary, would you go out with me?" And she thought about it, and she said, "Yes." And they started dating, I know, right? They started dating. Well, one night, after a date, Richard pulled up in front of her house to drop her off, and that sweet little goodbye turned into 2 kisses, which turned into 3 kisses, and those kisses began to fold into one another until you couldn't count them anymore. Well, Mary, she lifted her chin up so that Richard could get to that spot. You know that spot? You know that spot? Yeah, everyone knows that spot. And he was kissing down her neck, and he got right here to where that crimson choker was. And right against her neck, he said, "Why do you always wear this thing?" And she laughed and said, "Well, maybe, Richard, if you're very, very lucky, one day you'll find out." And he said, "You should keep wearing it. It's hot." And she said, "Well, Richard, I think I will." Well, years passed, and Richard one day said to Mary, "If I could spend every day of the rest of my life making you smile and watching you laugh, I would be happy." And he got down on one knee and he opened that little velvet box. And Mary looked at him and she thought about it and she said, "Yes." And then she reached into her pocket and she pulled out a strand of crimson ribbon and she tied it right around Richard's wrist in a double knot so it would never come off. On the day of their wedding, she wore a gown that pulled around her feet and trailed behind her with 100 buttons down the back and crimson trimmings with that crimson choker around her neck, and then she had added a thin silver ribbon around the center. And her hair was down her back in waves, and she had ribbons of crimson and white and silver all threaded through her hair. And Richard could not take his eyes off her. They danced all night and she got a little sweaty. And then that night, Richard stood behind her, close enough that she felt his breath on the back of her neck. And he undid those buttons, one after another, 99, 100. And that dress slipped off and it pulled around her feet. And everything else that she was wearing slipped off and pulled around her feet. And Richard reached for that crimson ribbon, but Mary took his hand and put it in a place a little more interesting. Well, years passed, and Mary and Richard, I know, I'm sorry. Mary and Richard, they had a really good life. They had children. And when she was giving birth, the doctor really wanted her to take off that crimson choker, but she knew that Richard thought she was hot in it. So she said, "No, you can't take it off." And the doctor said, "No, you have to." And she said, "Shh, suck my dick, doctor!" And she took her the ribbon while she was giving birth. Beautiful children. And they had a good life, not an easy life. Money was sometimes really tight, but it was a good life. And the day came when Mary, she wasn't strong enough to get out of bed in the morning. And Richard sat by her bedside, and he held her hand every day. And the day came when she could barely lift her hands up. And he knew that this was the time to say the thing he needed to say before there wasn't any time left. And he held her hand and he said, Mary, I need you to know that you have made me the luckiest man in the world. And she looked at him and thought about it. And she said, yes. And then she reached up to that ribbon, which was a little loose because she had lost so much weight. And she tugged that ribbon off and it slid off of her neck. And Richard watched as that gentle smile on her lips turned end over end, and he heard the thunk as her head landed on the bed next to her. Well, Richard screamed, and they found them both the next day, Richard still holding her hand. And it was true. Richard had spent every day of the rest of his life holding her hand and making her smile.